Hello and welcome to Pixels Book Club Episode 2. This is the series where we talk about all of the books, graphic novels and manga that I've been reading recently. Now, for the past few months I've actually been buying and reading more books than what I have been buying and playing video games, so it seems like this Pixels Book Club series is going to be more of a regular thing than I initially thought. So let's stop with all the fancy introductions and just get right on with it and talk about the first thing that I read all the way back at the beginning of January, which was the Marvel Zombies Omnibus. Now, I'm actually not that big of a Marvel guy. I've obviously seen some of the MCU films and I've watched all of the Spider-Man films, but outside of that, my knowledge about Marvel is a little bit hazy. But even considering that, the idea of this book immediately grabbed my attention because it mixes the Marvel universe with zombies. So the idea with this comic is that in an alternate Marvel universe, there's been a zombie virus outbreak and all of the heroes on the planet have succumbed to it, becoming flesh-eating zombies. But the twist with this story is that the superheroes not only keep all of the superhero powers even when they become zombies, but they also keep a degree of their humanity as well, even being able to talk. So this creates these really interesting and quite funny moments where the zombies actually recognise that what they're doing is evil and quite violent and sort of question what they're doing and why they're doing it. This particular omnibus collects 3 of the different sets of comics, so it collects the prequel that they did, it collects the first series and also Marvel Zombies 2. Definitely the best set of stories in this package though is the original Marvel Zombies comics, because I just think that that's where the series was at its peak in terms of quality. I think with Marvel Zombies 2, despite it still being really good and entertaining, it wasn't really necessary because the original Marvel Zombies actually ended really well, and to continue it past that point sort of makes the ending of the first one not as impactful. But it's definitely still worth a read, especially if you've got this and it's in the book anyway. So yeah, I would say that out of all of the graphic novels that I'm going to be talking about, this one was probably the best one that I read, and I would highly recommend that you pick it up. What's also good about it is that it does actually serve as a pretty good way of learning about all of the different superheroes' personalities as well, because they actually come across really well in this, despite them being zombies. Now, the book that I read straight after Marvel Zombies wasn't a comic book, and it also wasn't a novel or a manga either. It was actually a piece of non-fiction about a video game series that I absolutely love. It is the Crash Bandicoot Files. Now what this is, it's basically a collection of documents that the team at Naughty Dog made when they were making the first Crash Bandicoot game. And as a big fan of that series, this is really interesting to go through and it gives some really good insights into what the development process was like. The one thing that I will say with this though that was maybe a little bit disappointing is that despite it featuring loads of information in the form of graphs which detail the way that levels were going to be structured and loads of artwork as well, I do feel that maybe there could have been more information about what we were actually looking at, and maybe some actual interviews with the developers that went through what they did on the game and how things changed throughout the development. As it stands though, this is more or less just an unedited version of a big document that Naughty Dog compiled at the time of the creation of the game, but because of that it doesn't really explain quite a lot of things that we're actually looking at. So yeah, it's definitely a good read, especially if you're a really big fan of the series, but I probably wouldn't really recommend it for anybody else. Probably one of the most interesting things that I found out through this book was actually that Tiny Tiger and the Komodo brothers, who debuted in the second game, were originally going to be in the first game but under different names. I actually didn't know that, so I did learn something while reading this. Now, the next books I'm going to be talking about are a part of the same series, so I'll talk about them in the same section. I also think that this marks the first time that we're going to be talking about actual novels in Pixels Book Club, so that's pretty exciting. And what are these novels, I hear you ask? Well, they're a part of the Death Note series, and they are Death Note, the Los Angeles BB murder cases, and Death Note, L Changed the World. Now, being a big fan of the Death Note anime and a new fan of the Death Note manga, I'm still working on getting through that series. I wasn't sure what to expect from the novels, but it turns out they were actually pretty good. The first one, which was the Los Angeles BB murder cases, was actually written directly before the anime came out and just after the manga had finished, so this actually predates the anime. It also fits in very nicely to the continuity of the manga and the anime, because the events in this book are actually directly mentioned in both of those things. So it was very, very interesting reading through this book and learning more about that. So basically the gist of this first book is that it's set several years before the big Kira investigation, when Elle was solving another murder case happening in Los Angeles. At first, the events in the book almost seem a little bit trivial, and we're left wondering why Elle is even getting involved, considering that he normally only gets involved with really high-profile cases. But then later on there's a few twists that actually make the events unfolding a little bit more personal to Elle, and we get some background information on aspects of the anime and manga that we don't actually get in those things. So yeah, if you are a big fan of Death Note and you've not read this first book, I would definitely highly recommend that you do so, because it's really interesting how it gives you information about different aspects of the Death Note universe that we don't get in the manga or the anime. It also gives us a lot more information about a character called Naomi Mizora, who's a kind of minor character in the Death Note manga and anime, but her impact on the series as a whole is quite big, so it's good getting to know more about her. The second novel in this series was actually wrote quite a while after the anime, but it's Elle Changed the World, and just like the first novel, this is pretty good. The main reason that I wouldn't say that this is quite as good as the first novel is because this actually isn't set in the main continuity, and it's more so a sort of what-if scenario. Now, I can't actually talk about this book without ruining a major plot point of the Death Note anime and manga, so rather than talking about it in any detail, I'm just going to keep it brief by saying if you're a big fan of Death Note, definitely give this one a read because it's worth picking up and it's a fun ride. But if you have to pick between this one or the Los Angeles BB murder cases, definitely pick that one over this. Now, the next book that I read is yet another Marvel one, and it's yet another kind of weird Marvel comic, I would say, because it's Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe. So just like with the Marvel Zombies comics, this isn't a part of the main Marvel continuity, and it's more so just a side story set in an alternate universe. I think the reason that I've been gravitating more towards the alternate universe stuff is just because I feel like it's a huge commitment to get invested into the main universe comics, just because there's a lot of them, and I feel like it's a little bit daunting. So yeah, for now I'm kind of sticking with these weirder side stories, and when I heard about the details of this one, it sounded pretty interesting, so I picked it up. Now, the title of this comic actually sums up the plot very well, because it's basically just about Deadpool deciding to kill all of the other Marvel superheroes because he learns in a sort of like meta way that all of them are comic book characters and doesn't want them to just be existing for the sake of somebody else's entertainment. The idea is actually pretty cool, but I do think that the execution is a little bit sort of lacking. There's a lot of characters that are killed in this, but they have such minor scenes that it doesn't really have that much of an impact. I kind of almost think that the comic run should have been 2 or 3 times longer, just to really develop the story a little bit more and make the kill scenes all that much better. As it stands though, there's not really that much substance to it, and because you don't really learn very much about any of the characters, and I don't already have any pre-existing knowledge of a lot of these superheroes, it all just felt a little bit random to me. But maybe if you're a fan of the Marvel series, or a particularly big fan of Deadpool, this might be right up your street. But for me, I thought this one was maybe a little bit weak. With this being yet another omnibus edition, it also comes with Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe again, which rather than being a direct sequel is more so just like an alternate take on that original idea. So it's like a different version of Deadpool deciding to kill all of the Marvel superheroes for another entirely separate reason. Now, Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe again is probably even weaker than the first one, just because it's a lot more sort of like grounded and doesn't have that level of like meta humour that the first one has. So yeah, that was a little bit disappointing. Still, it was fun reading through it, but I would probably say that it's the weakest book of this episode. This next book is yet another Marvel comic, but this one is particularly interesting to me because it's about my favourite superhero, which is Spider-Man, and it is Spider-Man Life Story. Like the other two Marvel comics that we've talked about, this is yet another one that's set in an alternate universe and is its own self-contained story. And the premise with this one is basically the what if Spider-Man actually aged in real time rather than staying a teenager or just aging a lot slower than in reality. So to explain that a little bit more clearly, what this book does is says that if Spider-Man or Peter Parker was a teenager in 1962, which is when the first Spider-Man comic was released, what would happen if he was actually aging so that now, in the year 2022, he was an old man? So what I like about this is that it actually kind of goes through all of the major plot elements in the main Marvel continuity, so it actually acts as quite a good refresher as to what's going on in Spider-Man's life. So it goes through stuff like Kraven's Last Hunt, Secret Wars, Civil War, and that kind of thing. At the same time though, this is also the thing that I don't like about this comic, because it's not really that long. I mean, it is quite a thick comic, but in the grand scheme of things it's not that long of a time to summarise the entire story of Spider-Man. So because of that, there's times in this comic where there's big things happening, but they spend such a short amount of time on them that I'm not really understanding fully what's happening. So yeah, maybe that was a little bit of an issue with this, and it's probably more so aimed at people that already know the story of Spider-Man quite in depth. And looking at it from that perspective, you would probably really enjoy this. I mean, I still really enjoyed it anyway, but I feel like I would have enjoyed it more if I had read maybe some of the main Spider-Man stories. Still, that isn't to say that this isn't a really good comic, because I really enjoyed it, and like I say, the element of Peter Parker actually getting older and starting a family and stuff was really interesting, and I particularly enjoyed the bits about that. So yeah, if you're already a big fan of Spider-Man, I mean, if you're already a big fan, you've probably already read this, but if you haven't, give it a read, because I really enjoyed it, and this is coming from somebody who hasn't read any other Spider-Man stories yet. In fact, come to think of it, if you are a fan of Spider-Man, what Spider-Man comics should I be reading as somebody who's new to the series? Let me know in the comments. Now, one of the last books that we're going to be talking about is not only another novel, but unlike the Death Note ones, this is actually considered a classic, and it isn't actually connected to anything else, it's just its own thing. And it is George Orwell's 1984. This is probably a little bit of a weird choice for me to read considering all of the other stuff that's been in this video, but I actually think that this has been the best thing that I've read out of any of this stuff. It actually kind of surprised me just how good this book was and how good of a job it does at building the world and the characters who live within it. And I know that that's probably silly to say because this is probably one of the most famous books of all time, but as someone who doesn't normally read a lot of books, I was kind of thinking that maybe I wouldn't be able to get into it or appreciate it, but it turns out I was wrong. This is genuinely a really riveting book, and if you haven't already read it and you think you would be interested in its universe or its themes, you should definitely give it a read. So to sum up quickly what this is about without ruining anything that actually happens in it, it's basically about this person called Winston who's living in this alternative future where everything is monitored and he's basically living in a surveillance state. It's kind of weird reading this book now though, because obviously at the time it was written, I think in the 60s, it was describing the future, but now reading it in 2022, it's describing an alternate past. So that element of it is a little bit strange. But even considering that, it doesn't really lose any of its relevance, and in fact, I would say it's actually really relevant even today. But yeah, getting back to what I was talking about, it's about this person called Winston living in this alternative future where he lives in a surveillance state and the world is basically monitored and really tightly controlled. The government, or the party as they're referred to in the book, doing things like tampering with newspapers, tampering with TV shows, and basically altering history in order to maintain an even better degree of control over the present. The people existing in this book's universe are constantly at a level of uneasiness due to being in constant war and being on rations and being monitored all the time. But Winston somewhat kind of sees through all of that and discovers that he's sort of being trodden on by the party. Obviously though, he's just one person and can't really do much about this, especially with him being monitored all the time. So it kind of like goes through these little rebellious streaks that get bigger and bigger throughout the book. And I guess I should stop there, because otherwise going any further would ruin what happens. But yeah, if you're a fan of sort of almost kind of post-apocalyptic vibes without actually being post-apocalyptic, then this book is definitely worth a read. If you're a fan of like almost fictional political dramas as well, this might be interesting. And if you're just a fan of kind of like bleak fiction, I think this would be right up your alley. Now the last book, or rather books, that I want to show you are actually connected to something that we talked about in the last Pixels Book Club episode, and that is the fact that I've now doubled my Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle collection. I've got 3 more of these massive IDW hardcover volumes. As you can imagine, based on the fact that I've got another 3 of these, meaning that I've got 6 in total now, I am really enjoying this series. And at this point, I think I'm committed to actually finishing the series and continuing to read it, because it's still ongoing to this day. Obviously, I can't really go into anything that happens in these 3 particular volumes, because you would be a little bit lost because you haven't read the first 3. But they're really good, I'm really enjoying them, and like I say, I'm going to keep reading them. Plus, another great thing about them is that because they are so big and look so awesome and really high quality, they look really good on your shelf as well, especially when you've got 6 or more of them like I have. But with that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle update finished, I think that's the end of the video. That is everything that I've been reading over the last couple of months. And I'm looking forward to reading some of the other stuff that I've been picking up over those 2 months as well, because I'm actually building up quite a bit of a book collection now. So after I've read some of the other stuff, I can't wait to make the next episode to share my thoughts with you. As always, let me know what you've been reading in the comments too. Let me know if you've got any suggestions of things you think I might like based on all of this stuff. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!